10 years is a long time to keep a machine humming, a floor safe, and a workforce steady. I had done all of that at Cedar Bend Manufacturing quietly, without applause. I wasn't asking for fireworks, only a fair raise. My request listed the safety upgrades I had implemented, the crises I had helped the company survive, the clients I had soothed back into loyalty, numbers and names, proof carved into ledgers and contracts. I placed the document on Darren Hale's desk, the new CEO who had been in charge for just 3 months. He scanned it, his mouth curling in a smirk that already told me the outcome. What achievements deserve a raise? He sneered loudly enough for the directors in the room to hear. Then he flicked my request into the trash can like it was a gum wrapper. A few chuckled, unsure if they should laugh or look away. I stood there, the humiliation sharp but strangely clarifying. I kept my face calm, my voice still. "Thank you for your time," I said evenly. I turned spine straight and walked out as though nothing had touched me. Inside, though, something had shifted. Years of loyalty erased in a second. Yet it did not feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of something else. Back in my office, I closed the door and let the silence sit heavy. My colleagues peeked in, expecting an outburst. Instead, I smiled, small and contained, because anger wouldn't serve me. Precision would. I had spent a career learning how every bolt and conveyor fit together, how one hidden misalignment could shut down an entire system. People were no different. Companies were no different. Darren thought he had dismissed me. He had only awakened me. I picked up a notebook I had kept tucked away, filled with observations, irregularities, notes no one else cared to keep. I ran my fingers over the pages and felt steadier than I had in months. The humiliation had burned, yes, but what remained was clarity. I knew exactly where I would begin. And so, the next morning, I walked into Cedar Bend on time, not early, not eager, just present, and very, very quiet. The morning after Darren tossed my request into the trash, I arrived at work at 8 o'clock sharp, not 7. Not before dawn like I had for years, just 8. For the first time in a decade, I didn't bring an extra set of reports tucked under my arm. I didn't stay late to walk the floor, double-checking every shipment or soothing anxious clients after hours. I did exactly what my job description required, nothing more. At first, no one noticed. The gears of Cedar Bend kept turning, though not quite as smoothly. A shipping crate sat unclaimed on the dock for a day because I hadn't been there to push the paperwork through. A purchase order went unsigned until a customer called twice, irritated. The bottlenecks were small, almost invisible, but they accumulated. I had always been the quiet oil in the machine, and now that oil was gone, my colleagues began to ask. "Where's Ellie Marvin from logistics?" hovered in my doorway. Puzzled. "You're not coming down to review manifests." I smiled politely and shook my head. "Not my responsibility." "Marvin." His brow furrowed. He walked away, unsettled. Clients noticed next. Emails went unanswered until the assigned reps got around to them. One longtime customer called directly, frustration in his voice. I listened, then redirected him to the proper line, even though I could have solved it in 2 minutes. He hung up dissatisfied. Darren heard rumblings but waved them off. "She's grown lazy," he told the managers at a meeting, his tone dismissive. I sat silently at the table, my face giving nothing away. Let him believe it. He couldn't see that the cracks in his shiny empire were spreading, hairline fractures running through every department. And the beauty of it was that I didn't have to lift a finger to make them appear. All I had to do was nothing extra, nothing unpaid, nothing unseen. The system would reveal itself for what it was without me propping it up. That night, I went home earlier than I could remember, sat at my kitchen table, and opened the old binder where I had kept notes for years. At home, the binder lay open under the dim kitchen light, its pages covered with years of small notations. Most people would see them as scrap dates, initials, odd invoice numbers, but I had always known details could be lifelines. My father taught me that. He worked the docks until his hands cracked and his lungs gave out. And he always said, "Ellie, the difference between safety and disaster is one unchecked box." I learned to notice what others ignored. This town raised me the same way it raised steel and timber hard, steady and honest. People knew my face in the grocery store, at church, on the plant floor. I wasn't extraordinary. I was consistent. That had been my power. When my husband died 12 years ago, leaving me to raise Caleb alone, it was this job and this community that steadied me. Cedar Bend gave me a paycheck, a schedule, a place where my grief could be absorbed into routine. I gave it loyalty in return. Caleb is 20 now, away at college studying engineering. Every tuition bill I paid, every late-night overtime shift I took, it was all for him. Ambition had never driven me. Stability had. I wanted him to walk into a future where he never had to beg for dignity. That was my fuel. But Darren's words had unsettled something deep inside me. What achievements deserve a raise he had mocked, as if decades of work could be erased with one sneer. In that instant, I saw the truth my silence, my quiet sacrifices, had allowed men like him to mistake loyalty for weakness. I thought about Caleb, about the kind of man he was becoming, and knew I couldn't let that example stand. If I allowed myself to be erased without protest, what lesson would I leave behind for him? That survival meant swallowing humiliation, that dignity was negotiable. No. The time for quiet endurance had ended. The years of keeping records, of watching without speaking, were no longer just habits. They were weapons waiting to be sharpened. I turned another page in the binder, eyes settling on a vendor name I had circled years before, and felt the first spark of a plan take hold. The circled vendor name stared back at me like a breadcrumb I had left for my future self. Years of notes filled that binder, tiny irregularities I had noticed but set aside while juggling crises, overtime, and life itself. Now, with clarity burning in me, I combed through the pages as though they were maps. One pattern rose quickly, a supplier that billed rush fees almost monthly, even on orders I knew had been routine. The dates on some invoices didn't align with the actual delivery logs. Worse, a few quality control forms carried altered timestamps, the kind only someone inside could manipulate. I photocopied everything and tucked the originals back into their place. Then I called Marvin. He was a clerk in logistics, reliable, quiet, and one of the few who had never treated me as background noise. When he arrived in my office after hours, I slid the copies across the desk, cross-checked these against the master logs. I told him, "See if the numbers add up." Marvin adjusted his glasses, frowning as he read. "These look off," he muttered, already pulling out a notepad. "Give me a day." The following afternoon, he returned with sheets of comparisons. "Ellie, you're not wrong," he whispered. "These rush fees, they're tied to a supplier that barely exists on paper. No address, no phone number, just a P.O. box. A shell supplier. It was the kind of trick I had only read about in trade journals, the kind of scheme that siphoned money right under everyone's noses." My stomach clenched, not with fear, but with recognition. This was bigger than insults and bruised pride. This was fraud. But even with Marvin's findings, I knew it wasn't enough. A few mismatched dates and phantom addresses could be explained away, buried under excuses. What I needed was proof so solid it could not be ignored, evidence that would stand no matter who tried to spin it. That night, I closed the binder gently and stared out my office window. The cracks I had let widen were leading somewhere darker, and I knew I couldn't follow them alone. The more I looked at the numbers, the clearer it became that I couldn't untangle this web alone. Paper trails can lie if you don't know how to read them, and I needed eyes sharper than mine. That's when I thought of Gail. She had retired from auditing 5 years earlier, but in her day she was the one everyone feared, unyielding, meticulous, Incorruptible. I called her one evening, half expecting her to decline. Instead, she chuckled softly. Ellie, I always said you were the only one paying attention. Bring me what you've got. I drove to her modest house with copies of the invoices and QC reports. She spread them across her dining table like puzzle pieces. See this, she said, pointing at overlapping signatures. These aren't just sloppy, they're forged. And here QC reports backdated to cover delivery gaps. She looked up at me, eyes sharp behind her glasses. Someone's been falsifying compliance to keep contracts alive. Her confirmation steadied my resolve. But I knew documents alone wouldn't be enough. I needed something visual, undeniable. That's where Frank came in. He worked in IT and security. Younger than me, but one of the few who treated me with respect. One night, I found him in the server room. Frank, I said quietly, do the cameras keep footage after 30 days? He hesitated, then nodded. Officially, no. Unofficially, I can pull archives if I know what I'm looking for, I told him. A week later, he slid a flash drive across my desk. Don't tell me how I got this, he said. On the screen, Darren appeared in grainy black and white, meeting after hours with a so-called consultant. I recognized the name immediately, the same tied to the shell supplier Marvin had uncovered. With Gail's analysis, Marvin's comparisons, and Frank's footage, I had more than whispers. I had sparks. Still, scattered sparks only light corners. I needed a blaze strong enough to burn through boardroom walls. So I gathered the binders, the logs, the footage, and reminded myself it wasn't enough to catch Darren lying. I had to make it impossible for him to escape the truth. The deeper we dug, the clearer the pattern became. Marvin came to me one morning, pale but resolute, holding a folder under his arm. I traced the procurement orders, he said, lowering his voice. The email metadata points straight to Darren's account. He personally authorized changes to vendor routing after hours, from his office. I thanked him, then handed the pages to Gail. She examined them alongside her stack of QC reports, running her finger across the forged signatures she had already flagged. These are deliberate, she muttered. Same hand, different names. If this went before regulators, it would be damning. Meanwhile, Frank worked quietly in the background. One evening he slid into my office, shutting the door behind him. I pulled the system logs, he said, setting down a flash drive. Darren bypassed the approval hierarchy more than once. Direct entries into procurement with no secondary sign-off. It's all time-stamped. I exhaled slowly. Each thread was strong, but together they were a net. The risk, though, was losing credibility if even one piece seemed tainted. So I did what I had always done best, documented. Every copy was backed up, every original sealed. Witness statements were signed and dated. I even logged when Marvin, Gail, and Frank handed me materials, creating a chain of custody no one could break. Looking at the growing pile of binders, drives, and notes, I felt both the weight of responsibility and the strange steadiness of purpose. Darren thought arrogance made him untouchable. He had no idea loyalty and diligence could become weapons sharper than any knife. Still, the question loomed what to do with this net once it was woven. Evidence without direction was just paper in a drawer. To use it meant stepping into a battlefield I had avoided for years. That night, as I locked the latest binder in my cabinet, I knew the time for shadows was ending. The truth was ready to leave my hands, and I had to decide whose hands it should fall into first. Once the evidence was secured, I knew it couldn't linger in my cabinet forever. To move forward, it had to reach someone who could not be bought. Someone with authority Darren couldn't simply sneer away. That someone was Agnes Whitcomb. Agnes had been on Cedar Bend's board longer than I had worked at the plant. Her reputation was one of rare integrity in a world where favors and handshakes often outweighed truth. I arranged a quiet meeting through the company's legal counsel, bypassing Darren entirely. When Agnes entered the room, her posture was straight, her eyes sharp as glass. "I've been told you have something important," she said. Without a word, I slid the sealed packet across the table. Inside invoices, signatures, logs, and video evidence. She didn't open it immediately, she just studied me. "Do you understand the risk of handing this over?" "I understand the risk of not handing it over," I replied. My voice didn't waver. She nodded, then passed the packet to counsel with precise care. "This will not be buried. I'll initiate an independent investigation. Until then, silence is your shield." Walking out of that office, I felt lighter, not safe, but steadier. For once, the truth wasn't just in my hands. Darren, though, sensed the shift. He couldn't see the evidence, but he saw the change in me. At the next staff meeting, he leaned back in his chair and said with false cheer, "Ellie, still taking notes. Maybe you'll earn that raise in another 10 years. Laughter rippled across the table, forced and uneasy. I smiled faintly, giving nothing away. Let him mock. His arrogance was the one accomplice I didn't have to bribe. He had no idea the cannon was already loaded, he just hadn't heard it fire yet. And when the board finally called him behind closed doors, I knew the sound would echo through every corridor of Cedar Bend. When the summons came, it was quiet and discreet, a note from counsel requesting my presence outside the boardroom. I waited in a narrow hallway, binder in hand, while behind the heavy doors the directors sat in judgment. Through the wood, muffled voices rose and fell, but I could imagine every turn of the exchange. They began with the evidence packet. One by one, the documents were laid out: invoices with their padded fees, QC reports with falsified dates, emails routed from Darren's account, and finally, the grainy footage Frank had pulled. I had seen it all. But in that setting, the long, polished table, the directors in their suits, it carried a weight even I hadn't anticipated. Darren did exactly what I expected. First, denial. He leaned into his easy smile, claiming the signatures were fabrications, the invoices clerical errors. When that faltered, he shifted to charm, reminding the board of his visionary leadership and fresh direction. But charm cannot erase timestamps. As the video played, showing him meeting in secret with the so-called consultant tied to the shell supplier, his mask cracked. He pivoted again, this time to blame. He threw subordinates under the bus, painting them as incompetent or deceitful. But the signatures matched his hand. The logins came from his account, and the dates aligned too perfectly. The board didn't erupt in anger. They simply grew still. The kind of stillness that carries judgment heavier than words. Finally, Agnes spoke until an external audit concludes. "You are placed on administrative leave." The sentence landed like a gavel. Darren paled, his protests ignored as the directors gathered their files. The door opened and he swept past me, jaw tight, eyes dark with fury. Whispers began almost immediately. Threading through the corridors, Ellie had the goods. No one said it to my face, but the shift in glances was unmistakable. I was no longer invisible, but I knew better than to celebrate. A throne had only shaken, not yet fallen. And in the space left by uncertainty, the question lingered who would dare step forward to steady it. The audit came swift and merciless. Independent investigators tore through procurement files, cross-checked safety reports, and compared Darren's accounts against bank records. Within weeks, the picture was undeniable: inflated invoices, falsified compliance, deliberate misreporting. What I had suspected for years, they now confirmed in black and white. Regulators circled like hawks. Letters arrived from oversight agencies, and industry partners demanded explanations. Some clients threatened lawsuits if guarantees weren't met. For Cedar Bend, the scandal wasn't just internal rot, it was a public reckoning. The board could no longer protect Darren. At the emergency session, his resignation was demanded and accepted. The news leaked within hours: CEO resigns amid fraud probe. By morning, every trade paper carried the headline. Recruiters, once eager to court him, went silent, His name became shorthand for arrogance and collapse. I watched it unfold without glee, only a steady calm. He had mocked my worth, tossed my request into the trash, and now the same carelessness had shredded his career. The board, desperate to steady the company, convened a stabilization task force. To my surprise, I was asked to join for weeks. I sat at long tables with lawyers, directors, and consultants, offering the kind of practical solutions I had been giving quietly for years. Only now, people listened. Eventually, they offered me the role of director of operations. I didn't accept immediately. Instead, I laid out my terms, transparent oversight, stronger employee protections, and a plan to rebuild client trust piece by piece. I told them Cedar Bend could not be patched with quick fixes. It had to be rebuilt on dignity. They agreed. For the first time, I felt not just useful, but heard. As I signed the papers for the new position, I thought of the binder that had started it all, and of the quiet strength it had taken not to erupt when I was humiliated. What began as one insult had become the turning point of my life. And yet, I knew the true test wasn't ending Darren's reign. It was what I would build in the space he left behind. Stepping into the role of director of operations, I carried no banner of revenge. This wasn't about Darren anymore. It was about restoring the company I had given half my life to. My first acts weren't grand announcements, but quiet, necessary repairs. I created compliance programs that could withstand scrutiny, designed training sessions that taught accountability, and drafted protections for whistleblowers so no one else would have to risk silence the way I once did. On the floor, workers greeted the changes with cautious hope. When safety protocols were enforced with fairness rather than intimidation, cheers rippled quietly through the plant. Clients began to return calls with less suspicion, their trust rebuilding piece by piece. I didn't need applause. I only needed to see Cedar Bend steady again, carried not by arrogance, but by integrity. At home. Caleb returned for a weekend visit. We sat at the kitchen table where I had first opened that old binder months before. He looked at me with a mix of pride and curiosity. "Mom," he asked softly, "did you win?" I smiled at him, the same way I had smiled through humiliation, but now with a deeper peace. "No, son," I answered. I proved that truth still matters. Darren's name faded quickly from the headlines, his career collapsing into silence. Recruiters shunned him, and in an industry that thrives on memory, he became a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, I remained not triumphant, but steady, exactly as I had always been. One afternoon, I paused by the corner of my office, where the wastebasket sat. I thought of that day when my request was tossed aside like nothing. Then I turned to the window, sunlight spilling across the desk now marked with my title plate. He had sneered at my worth and thrown me away. But the evidence I carried spoke louder than his arrogance ever could, and in the end, it wasn't revenge. I found it was proof that dignity, once defended, becomes unshakable.